The Galactic Empire had rules for everything. There were rules for how a planet had to request membership, rules for how long negotiations had to last, rules for how many ships a species was allowed to own before it became a military threat. There were rules about trade, about language, about the size of a colony before it earned a seat in the Grand Senate. The Empire had been building these rules for 11,000 years, and in all that time, not a single species had ever broken them. Not really. Some had tried. None had succeeded. So when the signal came from the outer rim, from a tiny blue-green world orbiting an ordinary yellow star in a completely unremarkable arm of the galaxy, nobody on the Grand Senate floor expected anything unusual. Ambassador Voss Krell of the Theron people was the first to notice something strange. He was sitting at his station during a routine morning session, reviewing the latest batch of contact reports, when one file made him pause. He read it again, then a third time. Then he called his assistant over. "Mirren," he said slowly, "run a check on Sector 7G, third ring, yellow star systems." Mirren, a young Theron with pale green scales and wide gold eyes, tapped at the console. "Running now, Ambassador. What am I looking for?" "A planet," Voss Krell said. "One that apparently sent us a communication." "That happens all the time," Mirren said. "Not like this." Voss Krell turned the data screen toward her. "They didn't request contact. They didn't follow the first contact protocol. They didn't submit a preliminary species identification form. They just talked to us, like they'd been doing it for years." Mirren looked at the file. Her eyes went a little wider. "What did they say?" "They said, and I am reading this exactly." Voss Krell cleared his throat. "Hello out there. This is Earth. We've been picking up your communications for about 60 years now. Took us a while to decode them. Nice encryption, by the way. Our people enjoyed the puzzle. We figured you'd get around to saying hello eventually, but you seem busy, so we thought we'd start. We're attaching a full cultural and biological profile, our current technology index, a map of our solar system, and a brief history of our species. Please let us know if you need anything else. We look forward to talking." Mirren stared at the screen for a long moment. "They attached a cultural profile?" she asked. "Yes." "And a technology index?" "Yes." "And they decoded our encrypted communications in 60 years?" Voss Krell folded his hands together in the way his people did when they were trying to stay very calm. "That appears to be what happened, yes." "That's..." Mirren paused. "That's not in the records." "No," Voss Krell agreed. "It is not." He pulled up the Empire's contact database. In 11,000 years of expansion and diplomacy, the Empire had made contact with 412 sentient species. Every single one had followed some version of the same basic pattern. They were discovered, usually by an Empire scout ship, usually while they were still in their early space age. A team would observe them for a generation or two. Then, when the timing was right, the Empire would make formal contact, introduce the Grand Senate, explain the rules, and begin the long process of integration. It was orderly, it was safe, it had always worked. Not one of those 412 species had ever introduced themselves first. Not one had spent 60 years quietly decoding Empire communications without anyone noticing. Not one had simply sent over their own species profile like they were filling out a job application. Voss Krell sent the file up the chain. By the end of the day, it had reached the Oversight Committee for New Species. By the following morning, it was on the desk of High Senator Drael Var, who ran the committee with the kind of careful, methodical energy that had kept the Empire's expansion smooth for 3 centuries. Drael Var read the file. Then she called an emergency meeting. "Tell me what we know," she said, settling into her seat at the head of the long obsidian table, where her 7 senior advisors were already waiting. Advisor Peth Solane, who handled alien biology, spoke first. "The planet calls itself Earth. The species calls itself human, or sometimes Homo sapiens, though it seems human is the common use name. They are bipedal, warm-blooded, bilaterally symmetrical. They breathe oxygen and drink water. Nothing unusual in terms of biology. Remarkably similar to the Verith, actually, except for the lack of a tail and the fact that they only have 2 eyes." "Threat assessment?" Drael Var asked. Advisor Keem, who handled military affairs, cleared his throat. Based on the technology index they provided, and I want to emphasize that we have not independently verified any of this, they are currently capable of low-speed interstellar travel. They have fusion power and basic shield technology. They describe roughly 400 military vessels, though the index notes that number is approximate and subject to change depending on current political situation. What does that mean? Someone at the table asked. We're not sure, Keem admitted. It may mean their government is unstable, or it may mean they expand and contract their fleet rapidly in response to circumstances. We don't have enough data. Draelvar looked at the technology index herself. Something about it bothered her. It was very detailed, almost too detailed. Most species, when they compiled a technology index for the first time, tended to either overstate or understate what they had. They either puffed themselves up to seem more impressive or downplayed their capabilities out of caution. The humans had done neither. Their index read like something written by a species that had done this before. It was calm, matter-of-fact, and precise, in a way that felt almost practiced. Has anyone responded to them? She asked. Not yet, Voskrell said. Protocol requires. I know what protocol requires. Draelvar set down the file. I want a full analysis completed before we respond. I want to know how they decoded our communications. I want to know why our long-range sensors never flagged this planet as a developing civilization. And I want to know, she tapped the last page of the attached history document, what this is. Everyone leaned forward. The page she was pointing to was near the end of the human historical summary. It was a brief section titled Major Conflicts, and it listed wars. Dozens of them. Hundreds, if you counted the smaller ones. The list went back thousands of years. The humans had been fighting each other, it seemed, for almost the entirety of their recorded history, and the list didn't seem to be getting shorter the closer it got to the present. They fight among themselves, Peth Solane said carefully. Many species do in their early stages, someone else said. Not like this, Draelvar said. Look at the scale. Look at the technology they were using in these later conflicts. They were dropping weapons capable of destroying entire cities on each other while still in their pre-space age. And yet they survived. They didn't wipe themselves out. They just kept going. The room was quiet for a moment. I want that analysis, Draelvar repeated. Full team, 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, the analysis came back. Voskrell presented it personally, because 3 of the 5 analysts who had compiled it had specifically requested to be present when it was delivered to the Oversight Committee. They stood in a line along the wall, quiet and still, like people who had seen something they couldn't stop thinking about. The short version, Voskrell began, is that the humans are not what we expected. Start from the beginning, Draelvar said. The sensors, Voskrell said. The reason we never flagged Earth as a developing civilization is because our long-range sensors use biological complexity markers to identify pre-spaceflight species. Earth didn't trigger those markers because the humans, when our sensors last swept that sector, were already in their industrial period. They moved through that stage faster than any species we have on record. Our sweeps hit them too early, then too late. We missed the window. How fast? Someone asked. From early industry to nuclear capability, in approximately 150 years, Voskrell said. The room was quiet again. The average for other species, he continued, is around 800 years. The fastest previous case was the Dreth, at around 300. The humans did it in half that. And the communications? Draelvar asked. They decoded our encryption using a combination of mathematical pattern analysis and what their documentation calls brute force computational methods. In practical terms, they built machines specifically designed to try billions of combinations per second until they found the right ones. They call this type of machine a computer. We have equivalent technology, but we use it differently. They applied it to the encryption problem in a way our analysts describe as aggressive and unconventional. Meaning they didn't try to understand the logic of the encryption first. They just kept hitting it until it broke, Voskrell said. 60 years of constant computational attack. Our encryption was designed to resist intelligent analysis. It was not designed to resist 60 years of machines, simply trying every possible answer. One of the analysts by the wall made a small sound. It might have been a laugh. quickly suppressed. Drael Var looked at the analyst. The analyst looked at the floor. "And the history?" Drael Var asked. Voss Krell was quiet for a moment. "The historical analysis is the part that concerns the team most," he said carefully. "The humans have been in constant armed conflict for the entirety of their recorded history. Their wars have grown larger and more destructive as their technology has improved. Despite this, they have never reached a point of civilizational collapse. Every time they have approached what we would call an extinction-level event, and they have approached it several times, most notably during a period they call the Cold War, they have pulled back. Not because someone stopped them, because they chose to stop themselves." "That's unusual," Drael Var said. "It is," Voss Krell agreed. "Most species that develop weapons at the speed humans do either use them and collapse, or develop them slowly enough that they have time to mature socially before reaching that threshold. The humans did neither. They built the weapons, they pointed them at each other, and then they decided, at the last moment, not to fire, multiple times, over several generations." "What does that tell us about them?" Drael Var asked. Voss Krell looked at his file. Then he looked up. "We don't entirely know," he said, "but what it tells us is that they are very good at existing in a state of extreme danger, without being destroyed by it. They are comfortable with threat in a way that other species simply are not." He paused. "The analyst's recommendation is that we proceed with formal contact, but carefully." Drael Var looked at the three analysts standing by the wall. "Do you have anything to add?" she asked them. The youngest one, a Tharan who couldn't have been more than 30 cycles old, spoke up. "I read all of their history," she said. "Not just the summary, the full documents they attached. They have a saying. I think it matters." "What saying?" Drael Var asked. The young analyst folded her hands. "Whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger." Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Drael Var picked up the file and said, "Get me a secure channel. We're going to say hello to Earth." Back on Earth, in a large and slightly chaotic office building that served as the headquarters of the International Space Communication Agency, a man named Dr. Yusuf Okafor was eating a very cold sandwich and staring at a blank screen when the light on his console suddenly turned green. He sat up very straight. The light had been turning amber for 60 years, the amber that meant signal received, no response. It had turned green exactly once before in the agency's history, and that had been a false alarm caused by a satellite malfunction. But this green was steady and clean, and accompanied by a data package that his console identified as an encrypted communication in a format that looked, remarkably, very similar to the format they had decoded 60 years ago. Yusuf set down his sandwich. He pressed the intercom button. "Director," he said, "you're going to want to come in here." "I'm in a meeting, Yusuf," came the response. "Yes," Yusuf said, but they wrote back. There was a silence. Then the sound of a chair scraping and footsteps. The message, once decoded, was polite and careful and a little formal. It introduced the Galactic Empire and the Grand Senate. It explained, briefly, the structure of the organization and what membership meant. It asked the humans to confirm their identity, confirm their current population and territorial claims, and agree to a preliminary meeting with an Empire diplomatic team. It also noted, at the very end, in language that was clearly chosen with great care, that the Empire was very impressed with the humans' communication efforts and looked forward to a productive relationship. Yusuf read the message 3 times. Then he started writing the response. He kept it short. He'd always believed that the first thing you said to someone new mattered more than people realized, so he kept it short and honest and warm. "Hello," he wrote. "We're Earth. We've been hoping you'd call. We're ready to meet whenever you are. We'll put the kettle on." He stared at the last line for a second, then he left it in. Somewhere in the deep space between stars, in a room full of very serious diplomats, a translation program processed the message and converted it into standard galactic common. One of the analysts asked what "put the kettle on" meant. Nobody could find it in the database. Voss Krell added it to the list of things they didn't yet understand about humans. The list was already getting long. The diplomatic ship that the Empire sent to Earth was called the Sovereign Voice, and it was one of the most impressive vessels in the Grand Fleet. This was intentional. High Senator Drael Var had chosen it specifically because of how it looked. The Sovereign Voice was 3 kilometers long, shaped like an elegant crescent, with a hull that shifted colors in light, blue to silver to a deep, warm gold. It had been used for first contact missions 23 times, and every time, the effect on the receiving species had been the same: awe. Quiet, reverent awe, a reminder, politely delivered, of the difference in scale between a young civilization and an ancient empire. Ambassador Gress Toller had done this before. He'd spent 40 years in the diplomatic corps, and he knew exactly how first contact meetings went. The new species would gather whatever leaders they had. There would be speeches, probably some kind of ceremony. The new species would look up at the Sovereign Voice with wonder in their eyes. There would be careful, cautious negotiations. Everyone would be very polite. The Empire would outline the terms of membership. The new species would take some time to discuss it among themselves, sometimes years, and eventually they would agree, because they always agreed, because the alternative was to be outside the most powerful political body in the galaxy. Gress Toller had a speech prepared. He'd written it himself, which was unusual. Most ambassadors used the standard template, but something about this case made him want to put in extra care. He read their file every night, in the 2 weeks it took the Sovereign Voice to travel to the Outer Rim. He read about their wars. He read about their art. He read about a species that had, in the span of a few thousand years, gone from stone tools to nuclear reactors to interstellar communication, and had done all of it while simultaneously writing symphonies, building philosophical traditions, developing 17 major world religions, and finding time to document every living creature on their planet in extraordinary detail. He found the humans fascinating, strange and contradictory, and a little alarming, but fascinating. The Sovereign Voice dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's solar system, as protocol required. Gress Toller watched the planet come into view on the main screen, small, blue-green, cloud-covered, lovely, in the way that life-bearing worlds always were, and felt the familiar warmth of a moment he'd experienced 23 times before. Then his communications officer, a young Verith named Seski, looked up from her station with an unusual expression on her face. "Ambassador," she said, "there are ships." "Of course there are," Gress Toller said. "The humans have a fleet." "We knew?" "No, sir." Seski turned her screen around. "There are ships here, at the edge of the system, waiting." Gress Toller looked at the readout. He counted quickly. Then he counted again, because he thought he must have made an error. He had not made an error. There were 63 human ships positioned in a loose formation at the outer edge of the solar system, exactly at the point where the Sovereign Voice had dropped out of FTL. Not near Earth, not scattered around the system doing patrols, exactly here, in the precise location where an arriving vessel following standard approach vectors would emerge from faster-than-light travel. "How long have they been there?" Gress Toller asked. Seski checked. "Based on heat signatures and engine cooling patterns, approximately 4 days." "They've been waiting here for 4 days," Gress Toller said. "Yes, sir." "How did they know where we would come out?" Seski was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They decoded our communications for 60 years, sir, including, presumably, our navigational protocols." Gress Toller thought about that. He thought about it for a long time. Then he straightened his collar and said, "Hail them." The response came immediately. A human face appeared on screen. A woman, dark-skinned, with close-cropped gray hair, and the calm, direct expression of someone who was comfortable being in charge. She wore a simple dark uniform, with a single emblem on the shoulder. "Ambassador Gress Toller," she said. "I'm Admiral Chen Wei, of the Earth Combined Fleet. Welcome to our solar system. We're glad you made it safely." "Admiral," Gress Toller said carefully. "Thank you. I confess, I'm surprised to find you here, rather than near Earth itself." Admiral Chen smiled. It was a small, controlled smile. "We thought it would be polite to meet you at the door," she said, "rather than make you fly all the way to the house before anyone acknowledged you." Gress Toller blinked. "That is thoughtful." "We also wanted to make sure," Chen added, that your first impression of Earth was a good one. Sometimes large ships arriving at inhabited worlds makes people nervous. We didn't want anyone getting nervous on either side. Gress Toller looked at the 63 ships on his readout. His own fleet was 20 ships, all of them smaller than the Sovereign Voice. The human formation was spread wide enough to bracket the Empire fleet on 4 sides, without appearing aggressive. But Gress Toller had spent 40 years reading the body language of spacecraft formations, and he recognized the shape. The humans weren't just being polite. They were showing him, quietly and without saying a word about it, that they had thought about this, that they had planned, that they were ready. Of course, Gress Toller said, we appreciate the consideration. The meeting on Earth's surface was held in a city called Geneva, which the humans explained was traditionally used for international negotiations. Gress Toller appreciated the symbolism, though he noted privately that a city used for negotiations between human factions was not quite the same as a venue for first contact with an alien civilization. Still, the humans had made the choice deliberately, and he respected that. The building they used was large, modern, and entirely human in its design, all glass and sharp angles and efficient lighting. Gress Toller had expected something more ceremonial, perhaps. More decorated, more trying to impress. The humans had not tried to impress him. They had set up a working space. There were screens on the walls showing data feeds. There were people typing at stations along the sides of the room. The air smelled faintly of something warm and slightly bitter that one of his aides later identified as a beverage the humans called coffee. The human delegation was led by a man named Secretary General Andile Dlamini, a tall, broad-shouldered man with an easy, open manner that Gress Toller found unexpectedly comfortable. He had a translator implant that the humans had built themselves, another surprise, since the Empire generally provided translation technology to new species as part of the contact package, and the humans had simply built their own. "We have some questions," Secretary General Dlamini said, after the formal introductions were done and everyone had found a seat. Gress Toller had expected this. "Of course," he said, "the Grand Senate's contact process can seem complicated at first." "It does," Dlamini agreed pleasantly. "We've been studying it for about 20 years, since we decoded enough of your communications to understand the structure. We have some concerns about the membership terms, specifically around the technology sharing provisions in Article 7 and the territorial claim restrictions in Appendix D. We'd like to discuss those before we sign anything." Gress Toller looked at the man across the table. He'd been doing first contacts for 40 years. No species had ever arrived at a first meeting already having read the membership terms. No species had ever, in the first sitting, specified which articles they wanted to discuss. "You've reviewed the membership terms," Gress Toller said. "We have." Dlamini folded his hands. "We think the overall structure is very reasonable. We just want to make sure we understand the details before we commit. Is that a problem?" "No," Gress Toller said. "No, of course not. That's entirely reasonable." He said it calmly, professionally, and then he made a small note in his personal record, which he encrypted out of habit, that read, "This is not going to be like the others." The negotiations lasted 3 days. On the first day they covered Article 7. The humans had specific objections, not emotional ones, not territorial ones, but precise, logical ones, backed by examples from the Empire's own historical record that they had apparently compiled from the same communications they'd spent 60 years decoding. They knew what the technology sharing provisions had meant for other species. They had done the math on what those provisions would mean for Earth. Gress Toller's team had to call back to the Grand Senate twice for guidance, because the humans were raising points that weren't in the standard negotiation playbook. On the second day, they covered Appendix D, and the humans brought in a woman named Dr. Rosa Ferreira, who was apparently their leading expert on interstellar territorial law despite the fact that their species had only been in space for a generation. She had opinions. She had data. She had, at one point, a chart. Gress Toller found himself genuinely enjoying the conversation. On the third day, the humans proposed several amendments. They were reasonable amendments. They were, in fact, improvements. Gress Toller knew they were improvements, because 3 of his own team members told him so quietly during a recess. The final document was initialed by both sides on the evening of the third day. Dlamini shook Grestolar's hand, a human gesture that Grestolar had read about but never experienced. A firm, brief grip that was somehow both formal and warm at the same time. "Good meeting," Dlamini said. "It was," Grestolar agreed, and he meant it. Back on the Sovereign Voice, during the long journey home, Grestolar wrote his report. He tried to be precise and professional. He tried not to let his personal impressions color the official document too much. But at the end, in the section marked Analyst Notes, he wrote, "The human species presents a profile unlike any previously encountered. They are young but not naive. They are aggressive but not reckless. They approach situations with a combination of thorough preparation and flexible adaptability that is unusual in species at their developmental stage. They are comfortable with pressure, comfortable with uncertainty, and comfortable with complex social dynamics. They are also, perhaps most unusually, comfortable with other beings. They make room for the unfamiliar very quickly." He paused. Then he added one more line. "I believe they are going to be very important to the galaxy. I am not yet sure whether that is a good thing or a complicated thing, possibly both." He sent the report. Then he went to bed. On Earth, in the ISCA headquarters, Dr. Yusuf Okafor pinned a copy of the signed document to the wall above his desk. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he went back to his cold sandwich, which was no less cold than it had been when he first picked it up, and thought about what came next. What came next, as it turned out, was everything. Because somewhere on the other side of the galaxy, in a chamber that the Grand Senate did not know existed, a different set of eyes was reading a very different report. And those eyes were not friendly. And they were not surprised. And they had been watching Earth for a very long time. The Dreth Dominion had been watching the Grand Senate for a long time. Longer, in fact, than the Senate knew. The Dominion existed in a region of space that the Empire's charts marked as uninhabited, a cluster of dark, cold systems, far from the main lanes of galactic traffic. This was intentional. The Dreth were patient. They had learned, centuries ago, that it was better to be overlooked than to be noticed, because being noticed meant being integrated, and being integrated meant being controlled. The Dreth had their own empire. Smaller than the Grand Senate's and carefully hidden, but real, they had 41 systems. They had a fleet that had never been counted by anyone outside their borders, and they had a plan, a long, careful plan built across 300 years, that was now very close to the moment it was designed for. Commander Vreth Sol read the report from his contact inside the Grand Senate, and felt the first faint tremor of something he had not expected to feel: concern. It was not the contact with Earth that concerned him. He had known about Earth for years. The Dreth had been watching the sector for decades, and they had noticed the little blue-green world long before the Empire did. They had observed the humans for a while, decided they were interesting but not relevant to current plans, and moved on. What concerned him was the report from the contact meeting. His source, a reliable and long-standing informant within the Empire's diplomatic service, had been unusually specific in their description of the human delegation. They had already read the membership terms, the report said. They arrived at the table having studied 20 years of diplomatic communications. They proposed amendments that the Empire's own team agreed were improvements. They had a fleet positioned at the precise arrival point 4 days before the Empire ship arrived. Vrethsol read that last line 3 times. They had worked out the arrival coordinates from navigational protocols, in advance, and then they had been there, waiting, without anyone telling them to be. He set the report down. He looked at the map of the sector on his wall. He looked at Earth. The Dreth plan did not include Earth. It had never needed to. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Wait until the Grand Senate's expansion reached a certain critical point, when their resources were overextended and their attention was spread too thin, and then move. 41 Dreth systems, a hidden fleet, and 300 years of preparation. The Empire would not be ready. They were never ready for something they didn't see coming. But Earth was not part of the calculation. Earth was a new variable, and new variables, in a plan 3 centuries old, were not welcome. Vreth Sol called a meeting. The Dreth High Council met in a chamber deep inside their homeworld, in a room that had no windows and no recording devices. There were 7 of them around the table, all old, all experienced, all carrying the weight of the plan in their bones. Earth? Vrethsol said, placing the report in the center of the table. New Grand Senate member. Young species. They've been in space for less than a generation. They should not concern us. But they do, said Elder Kethmovar, the oldest person on the council, whose gray scales and slow, deliberate speech carried authority that no title could have added to. They do, Vrethsol admitted. The council read the report. The room was very quiet for a long time. They decoded 60 years of encrypted Imperial communications, said Council Seat Orofen. She was the youngest of the 7, sharp and fast, and very difficult to surprise. She looked surprised now. That's not nothing. No, Vrethsol said. Their fleet was at the arrival point 4 days early. Yes. They had read the membership terms and prepared amendments. Yes. Orofen looked at the report for a moment longer. What does our intelligence say about their actual military capability? That's the problem, Vrethsol said. We don't have good intelligence on their actual military capability. We observed them briefly years ago and assessed them as a mid-level developing species. We never did a full analysis. And now they're in the Grand Senate, Elder Kethmovar said. Yes. The old Dreth leaned back in his seat. Run a full analysis now. Everything we can gather without alerting either Earth or the Empire. I want to know what we're actually looking at before we adjust the plan. The analysis took 4 months. It came back, and Vrethsol read it alone in his office before he brought it to the council, because he wanted time to think before anyone else reacted. The humans, according to the analysis, had approximately 800 military vessels, twice what they had listed in the technology index they gave the Empire. This was not surprising. It was standard practice to understate military strength in first contact documents. What was surprising was the type of vessels. The human fleet was not built on any design philosophy the Dreth had seen before. Their ships were not elegant. They were not optimized for one type of mission. They were built in dozens of different configurations, many of which appeared to have been designed in response to specific previous conflicts, modified on the fly, and then mass-produced. The fleet looked like the product of a species that had been in a lot of fights and had learned something new from each one. The weapons were also unusual. The humans used a variety of systems rather than standardizing, which was inefficient by any military doctrine the Dreth studied, but which also meant that any countermeasure effective against one system would not work against all of them. They had kinetic weapons and energy weapons and missile systems and things that the analysts couldn't quite categorize, listed in human records simply as experimental. There was also a section of the analysis that dealt with human military culture, and this was the part that made Vrethsol sit very still for a long time. The humans trained constantly, not in response to specific threats, but as a baseline habit. They studied their own historical battles in detail, looking for failures. They had a concept they called after-action review, a formal process of analyzing what went wrong after every engagement, even successful ones. They had an entire discipline of strategic study, with schools dedicated to it, and they had been building that discipline for thousands of years. They also had something the analyst described, cautiously, as a cultural relationship with adversity that is fundamentally different from other species. Other species, when faced with a superior threat, tended to either fight or negotiate or flee. The humans did all three simultaneously. They were capable of fighting while negotiating, while planning to flee, while also looking for a way to turn the situation around entirely. They did not think in straight lines. They did not accept that a disadvantage was permanent. The analyst had included a quote from a human military text, with translation. Vrethsol read it 3 times. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. The question is not whether your plan will break. The question is whether you can think faster than it's breaking. Vrethsol brought the analysis to the council. The room was, again, very quiet. Our plan, said Orofen slowly, was designed on the assumption that when we move, the Grand Senate will not be able to respond effectively. We have studied their doctrine. We know their response times. We know their chain of command. She paused. Our plan does not account for a member species that will react differently from the Grand Senate doctrine. Correct, Vrethsol said. How does Earth respond to threat? Elder Kethmovar asked. We don't know exactly, Vrethsol admitted. The analysis gives us a picture of their capabilities and their history, but predicting specific human behavior under specific conditions is, the analysts describe it as difficult. They say the humans are consistently unpredictable in a way that is itself consistent. They always do something unexpected. They just don't always do the same unexpected thing. That's not a useful assessment, someone said. No, Vrethsol agreed. It is not. There was a long silence. Then Elder Kethmovar spoke. We have two options, he said. We can adjust the plan to neutralize Earth before we move on the Empire, or we can proceed on schedule and handle Earth as it comes. Neutralizing Earth means a direct engagement, Orofen said. We've never engaged a species we hadn't fully analyzed. We don't know enough about them. We know enough, said Council Seat Drevhall, who had been quiet until now. He was a military man, old-fashioned and direct, and he did not like complications. They have 800 ships. We have 3,000. The math is simple. The math was simple for the Grand Senate, too, Orofen said quietly. They had more ships, better encryption, and a 60-year head start. The humans decoded them anyway. Drevhall made a dismissive gesture. That was intelligence work, not combat. The kind of thinking that breaks encryption, Orofen said, is the same kind of thinking that breaks battle plans. Vrethsol looked between them. He thought about the report. He thought about 60 years of relentless, patient, methodical work, aimed at a single goal. He thought about ships waiting at an arrival point 4 days early. He thought about the quote from the human military text. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. We send a fleet, he said finally. Small. A test. We don't show them everything. We engage Earth, see how they respond, and use that information to adjust our approach before the main campaign. The Council agreed. It was a reasonable middle path, a careful approach. They selected 40 ships from the outer edge of their hidden fleet, experienced crews, well-armed, with standing orders to engage but not to commit fully, to probe and observe and report back. It was, everyone agreed, a very sensible plan. On Earth, in a monitoring station that the Empire didn't know existed, and the Dreth hadn't noticed because it was buried in the ice of an outer moon, a sensor operator named Kenji Watanabe stared at his screen and felt a cold feeling in his stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. He was tracking 40 ships. They had appeared at the edge of a quiet sector, moving on a heading that would take them through a sparse region of space, before turning toward Earth's system. They were not Grand Senate ships. The profiles didn't match anything in the database. He ran the profiles again, then again. Then he pressed the alert button and reached for his coffee, which was cold, because it was always cold, and said to the room at large, "We've got something." Nobody in the room knew yet exactly what they had, but somewhere in his bones, Kenji Watanabe had a feeling, and that feeling said, "They have no idea what they just started." The alert went through the Earth combined fleet in under 4 minutes. Admiral Chen Wei was in the middle of a budget meeting, which she hated more than almost anything except losing ships, when her earpiece chimed 3 times in a row. 3 chimes meant a priority 1 contact. She stood up, said "Excuse me," without waiting for anyone to respond, and walked out of the room. By the time she reached the command center, her senior staff was already assembled. The sensor feed was on the main wall, 40 blips, moving steadily, course projections overlaid in yellow. Unknown configuration, her tactical officer, Commander Habib, said. Not Grand Senate, not any recorded species. Power signatures suggest heavy armament. How long until they're in our outer system? Chen asked. At current speed, 19 hours. Current speed. Are they accelerating? Not yet. They're maintaining a steady approach. Could be a patrol, could be a probe, could be an advance element. Chen looked at the blips. 40 ships. Her fleet had 800, but most were spread across a wide patrol area. She could concentrate forces in about 12 hours, which left a 7-hour window that she did not like. She especially did not like it, because whoever was flying those 40 ships had to know the rough math. Any species capable of interstellar travel could estimate response times from patrol patterns. Have we hailed them? She asked. 6 times. said her communications officer. All standard frequencies, including the Grand Senate Universal Band. No response. Notify the Grand Senate, Chen said. Send them our sensor data. Do it now. And tell them we're not waiting for guidance. We're going to handle this ourselves and we'll report back. She paused. Be polite about it. Yes, Admiral. Get me Captain Torres on the Resolute and Captain Park on the Endurance. I want those ships at the interception point in 11 hours, and I want every available science vessel on the edge of the sensor shadow, not to fight, just to watch and record. I want to know everything about those ships by the time we're within communication range. She turned to Habib. What do we know about unknown configuration vessels that won't show Grand Senate ID? Based on what we decoded from Empire Communications, Habib said, there are at least 2 factions the Grand Senate knows about that operate outside their registry. One is a group of independent traders that the Senate tolerates. The other, he hesitated, is described in one communication as a persistent strategic concern in the outer sectors. The Senate doesn't go into details. They never gave it a name. So it might be the persistent strategic concern, Chen said. Possibly. All right. Chen straightened her jacket. Set condition 2 throughout the fleet. I want all captains on a shared channel, and someone get me coffee that's actually hot for once. She walked to her command chair and sat down. Around her, the command center hummed into a higher gear. People typed faster. Voices were lower and more focused. The easy energy of a normal day had been replaced by something cleaner and sharper. Chen had been in the military for 38 years. She had spent the first 20 of them in Earth's various national forces, the next 18 in the combined fleet that had grown out of a series of international agreements in the years after humanity confirmed they were not alone in the universe. She had trained for this kind of moment her entire career. She had also spent a significant amount of time hoping it would never come, while simultaneously making absolutely certain she was ready for when it did. She looked at the 40 blips. All right, she said quietly, to no one in particular. Let's see what you've got. The Dreth commander of the probe fleet was named Greth Val, and he was good at his job. He had led 32 engagements in the course of his career, most of them small-scale border disputes in the outer reaches of Dreth territory. He had a clean record and a practical mind, and he did not underestimate opponents. What he had underestimated slightly was how fast the humans moved. He had expected them to respond. He had expected them to scramble ships. He had expected some kind of challenge communication once he was close enough. All of this was normal. All of this was planned for. What he had not expected was to find, when his fleet dropped out of micro-FTL for a position check 7 hours into the approach, that there were already 2 human ships sitting exactly where he had calculated his fleet's most likely interception point to be. Not a fleet, 2 ships. Waiting. He checked his sensor readings. 2 ships. Yes, one was very large. Enormous, actually. Nearly 2 kilometers long. A configuration he hadn't seen in their intelligence files. The other was smaller, but gave off power readings that didn't match its size, which meant either its weapons were very efficient, or there was something in there he couldn't see yet. Both ships were just sitting there. Engines at low power. No weapons lock. No aggressive posture. His communications officer looked at him. They're hailing us, sir. Put it through, Greth Val said. The face that appeared on screen was a woman's, calm, brown-skinned, with lines around her eyes that suggested age, and a direct gaze that suggested something else entirely. Unknown fleet, she said. I'm Admiral Chen Wei, of the Earth Combined Fleet. You've been approaching our system for the last 7 hours without responding to our hails. I'd like to know who you are, where you're from, and what you want. I think that's a pretty reasonable thing to ask. Her tone was relaxed, almost conversational. Greth Val had expected aggression, or fear, or the stiff formality of an official communication. He had not expected someone who sounded like she was asking a neighbor why they were walking through her garden. He muted his channel. Analysis, he said to his tactical officer. She has 2 ships visible. Sensors suggest there are more in the shadow of the outer moon. At least 12, possibly more. They were already there when we dropped in. They've been there for several hours. They had been waiting in the sensor shadow for hours. Greth Val thought about that. They had predicted not just his course, but his most likely position checkpoint, and they had placed ships there in advance, quietly, without making it obvious. He unmuted. "I am Commander Greth Val of the Dreth Dominion," he said. He used the Dominion's name deliberately. If they had decoded Senate communications, they may have found references to the Dreth. If not, the name gave nothing away. "We are conducting a survey of this sector. We did not receive your communications." Chen's expression didn't change. "Our communications were on every standard frequency, including 4 that your ship's receiver arrays are definitely capable of picking up, based on the equipment profiles we've been reading off your hulls for the last 7 hours. She paused. "So you received them. You just didn't answer." Grethval said nothing. "That's okay," Chen said. "You don't have to explain, but I do need you to stop your approach. You're 40 hours from our inner system at current speed. I'd like you to hold your current position while we figure out a diplomatic path forward. The Grand Senate has people for this." "The Grand Senate," Grethval said carefully, "does not speak for the Dreth Dominion." "Understood," Chen said. "They don't speak for Earth either, really. We're new members. We're still figuring out the relationship." Another pause. "But I think we can all agree that 40 unidentified warships approaching an inhabited system without answering hails is a situation that benefits from a conversation before anyone does anything permanent." Grethval looked at his tactical display. His orders were to probe, to engage, see how they responded, and report back. He had planned for this to be a quick engagement. Hit them, see what they did, pull back. He had not planned for a conversation. He had also not planned for ships waiting in sensor shadows at positions his own tactical officer was now describing as optimal interception geometry if we continue our current approach. He thought about Vreth Sol's briefing, about the analysis, about the quote from the human military text. He made a decision. "We will hold our position," he said. "But I want to be clear, Admiral. This is a temporary accommodation, not a concession." "Of course," Chen said pleasantly. "Appreciated. We'll be in touch." The channel closed. In the command center of the Resolute, Chen turned to Habib. "How many do we have in position?" 14 ships in the sensor shadow. The Endurance group brought 6 more in from the far side while you were talking. "We can close the geometry in about 40 minutes. "Don't close it yet," Chen said. "Let them think about it. We want them to understand the situation without having to spell it out. And if they decide to advance anyway?" Chen looked at the blips. 40 ships. Heavy armament. Unknown capability. She thought about what she knew. They had identified themselves. That was useful. They had stopped. That was more useful. They didn't know exactly what they'd come here to start, but they were already reacting to a situation they hadn't planned for. People who were reacting instead of executing their plan were people who could be managed. "If they advance," she said, "we'll handle it." On the Dreth command ship, Grethval was composing a message to Vreth Sol. He chose his words carefully. He described the encounter precisely. He described the ships in the sensor shadow, the intercepted communications, the Admiral's calm tone, and the information she had chosen to reveal and not reveal. At the end, he added a personal note. It was not standard practice in military communications, but something about the situation made him feel it was important. "These are not the species in the file," he wrote. "The file is 2 years old and it was incomplete. What we are looking at now is something the analysis did not capture. I recommend we withdraw and conduct a full intelligence reassessment before any engagement. The situation on the ground is not what we projected." He sent the message. Then he looked at his tactical display and at the slowly shifting positions of the human ships in the sensor shadow. A shadow that was, he noticed, slightly less shadowy than it had been 20 minutes ago. He had a feeling that the Council was not going to take his recommendation. He had a feeling that the next few days were going to be very educational. He just hoped that educational and survivable were going to turn out to be the same thing. Vreth Sol did not take Grethval's recommendation. He read the message. He read it a second time. He noted the personal addition at the end, which was unusual enough to flag on its own. Grethval was not a man who added personal notes. He was careful and professional, and, in 32 engagements, had never deviated from his orders without direct cause. The deviation was the message. But the Council was not in the mood for caution. Drev Hall, The military man who had done the math on ships looked at the report and said, 40 ships against 20-odd human vessels in a sensor shadow is still favorable odds. We proceed as planned. If Grethval is nervous, he's been on patrol too long. Orofen was quiet. She looked at the part of the report that described the ships waiting in position, placed there before the Dreth fleet even arrived, in exactly the right spot. She thought about saying something. Then she thought about the 300 years of planning, about what they were committed to, about what it would mean to pull back now. She didn't say anything. Vreth's soul sent the order. Grethval was to advance, engage the human vessels, note their capabilities and withdraw. The council needed data. On the command ship, Grethval read the order. He looked at his tactical display. He looked at the human ships, whose positions he had been tracking carefully for the last 18 hours, while both sides held their positions, and the situation crackled with a tension that nobody had tried to diffuse. He had spent 18 hours watching the humans. He had watched them not fire. He had watched them shift their ships into formation patterns that he recognized as defensive preemptive, a posture that said, "We are ready to fight, but we are not starting it." He had watched Admiral Chen send 2 more communication attempts, both polite, both unanswered on his orders. He had spent 18 hours learning things about the humans that the file had not told him. He also, in that time, had noticed something the council did not know about. In the last 6 hours, the number of human ships in the sensor shadow had changed. It had changed quietly. The newcomers came in small groups, on low-power approaches, tucking into positions that overlapped with the existing ships, in ways that made the total number difficult to count precisely. But Grethval's tactical officer was good, and she had been counting. "How many?" Grethval asked her, for the 4th time. She gave him the same answer she'd given him before. At minimum 60. Possibly more. The geometry makes it hard to be exact. 60 ships, plus the 2 that were visible, plus whatever was near Earth itself. Against his 40. He read the order again. Advance, engage, report. He had his orders. He gave the signal to advance. In the command center of the Resolute, Chen was informed of the Dreth movement within 40 seconds of it beginning. "They're moving," Habib said. "All 40. Direct approach, accelerating." Chen looked at the board. She had 62 ships in position. The geometry was good. The Dreth were flying into the mouth of a closing formation. They didn't seem to know exactly how many ships were in the shadow. If they did, they wouldn't be advancing. "All ships," she said. "Active sensors. Let them see what they're flying into." For a military order, it was an unusual one, but Chen had thought about this for 18 hours, and she had a specific purpose in mind. Sometimes the best way to prevent a fight was to let the other side understand, clearly and completely, exactly what the fight was going to look like. 62 human ships lit up their active sensors simultaneously. The Dreth fleet was suddenly, comprehensively, painted by 62 separate targeting solutions. Not weapons locks, not yet, but the kind of detailed sensor sweeps that left no doubt about capability. On Grethval's bridge, every screen went bright at once. 62 ships, sir, his tactical officer said, and her voice was very controlled. Active sensors across our entire formation. We're fully painted. Grethval looked at the tactical display. The formation that had appeared was not a panicked scramble. It was not ships rushing to get into position. It was a complete, prepared, interlocking formation that had clearly been in place for hours, just waiting, dark and quiet, for exactly this moment. They had known he was going to advance. They had prepared for it. They hadn't fired yet. He reached for the communication channel. "Admiral Chen," he said. The response came immediately. "Commander Grethval, I was hoping you'd call." "You have 62 ships," he said. "I do," she agreed. "You had them in position before we began our approach." "Yes." A pause. "You planned this engagement before we even arrived." "We planned for several possible engagements," Chen said. "This is the one I was hoping for. The one where nobody fires. The one where you and I are talking while 62 of my ships are demonstrating to your 40 ships what the rest of this situation looks like." Her voice was still calm, still almost conversational. "I don't want to fight, Commander. I want you to go home, tell whoever sent you what you found, and come back with a diplomat instead of a fleet. Grethval was quiet for a moment. And if I advance anyway? Then I'll handle it, Chen said. But I won't be able to give you the same offer on the other side of that decision. On the Dreth command ship, Grethval looked at his crew. He looked at his tactical display. He looked at 62 human ships, arranged with geometric precision around his 40. He thought about the human military text. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. The question is not whether your plan will break. The question is whether you can think faster than it's breaking. He realized, just been outthought. Not outgunned, outthought. He signaled his fleet to stop. Then he composed a message to the Dreth High Council, marked urgent, and transmitted it on a secure channel. Then he opened a channel to Admiral Chen. "We are standing down," he said. "We will withdraw on the heading we came in on." "Appreciated," Chen said. There was something in her voice that wasn't quite warmth, but was close to it. "Safe travels, Commander." The Dreth fleet withdrew. Slowly, deliberately, with the dignity of a force that was leaving by choice, and wanted that to be clear. Grethval watched the human ships on his aft sensors, until they were specks, and then gone. He had expected to fire. He had not expected to talk. He had not expected to be seen coming from so far away. He had not expected the patience, all those hours of waiting, of not firing, of letting the situation develop, of using time as a weapon. He had not expected to feel, as his fleet passed the outer edge of the human system, a very strange thing: respect. The message he had sent to the council was simple. "We were anticipated. We were outmaneuvered without a single shot being fired. I am withdrawing as ordered, with all ships intact, but I want the council to understand. They knew we were coming. They knew how we would move, and they chose not to destroy us. That choice was deliberate. I don't know what it means yet, but I think we should find out before we try this again." Back on Earth, in the command center of the Resolute, Chen watched the Dreth ships disappear from the sensor board. Around her, the room was quiet in that particular way rooms get, when something that almost happened didn't happen, and everyone is taking a breath. "All clear," Habib said. "All clear," Chen confirmed. She stood up. She wanted to feel relief. She did feel it, a little, but mostly she felt the weight of what came next. "Notify the Grand Senate," she said. "Full report. The Dreth Dominion is real. They have ships, and they just did a probe of our system. The Senate needs to know." "What do we tell them about how it ended?" her communications officer asked. Chen thought about it. "Tell them the truth. They came, we talked, they left. No shots fired." She looked at the empty sensor board for a moment. "Also tell them that we'd like to meet with the Grand Senate's Strategic Council as soon as possible. We have some thoughts about the Dreth, and we'd like to share them." In the Grand Senate, the report from Earth arrived during an ordinary session and caused immediate and extraordinary disruption. 3 members of the Oversight Committee had to be helped to their seats. High Senator Drael Var read the report twice, then called Voskrell. "They identified the Dreth," she said. "They contained a Dreth probe, without our assistance, without a single casualty." "Yes," Voskrell said. "We have been trying to get solid intelligence on the Dreth Dominion for 80 years, Drael Var said. "We have never managed a direct confrontation that didn't result in either a retreat or casualties. The humans did it in 18 hours. "Yes," Voskrell said again. Drael Var was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Ambassador, remember what I said about this being different from the others?" "I remember. I want you to go back to Earth. I want to meet Admiral Chen. And I want to have a conversation. Not a diplomatic meeting, not a protocol session, a conversation. About the Dreth. About what comes next. About—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "What Earth is willing to do, and what Earth is capable of." Voskrell thought about his analyst, the young one who had read all the human history, and quoted their saying back to the committee. He thought about what that saying had meant to him then, and what it meant to him now, watching a species less than a generation into space deal with a threat that the Empire had managed only to observe from a careful distance for 80 years. "I'll go," he said. On Earth, in the ISKA headquarters, Dr. Yusuf Okafor pinned a new document to the wall next to the membership agreement. It was the after-action report from the Dreth encounter. He read it carefully, twice, before he put it up. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at both documents together, the membership agreement and the battle report. Hello, we're Earth. And then, 62 ships in a sensor shadow, nobody fires, everyone goes home. He thought about how far things had come since the green light on his console. He thought about how far things still had to go. He thought about the Dreth Dominion, somewhere out there, reading Grethval's report, making decisions. He thought about the Grand Senate, recalibrating. He thought about Admiral Chen, who had outthought a probe fleet from a species no one on Earth had known existed 6 weeks ago. He thought about 60 years of machines hitting encryption until it broke. He thought about a species that had survived everything it had ever thrown at itself, learned from all of it, and was now, slowly, carefully, with full attention, beginning to reach for the stars. He picked up his coffee. It was still cold. He drank it anyway. Outside, someone knocked on his office door. Dr. Okafor, the Grand Senate ambassador is asking for a meeting. They want to talk to us about the Dreth. They want our analysis. Yusuf set down his coffee cup. He looked at the wall, at the two documents side by side. He thought about how, not so long ago, the conversation had been a one-way signal aimed hopefully at an empty sky. He thought about how much things could change once someone finally wrote back. "Tell them we'll be happy to meet," he said, "and ask them to send over everything they have on the Dreth. All of it. Every scan, every communication, every piece of intelligence they've collected in 80 years. Do you think they'll share everything?" Yusuf smiled. "No," he said, "but whatever they give us, we'll work with. And then we'll figure out the rest ourselves." He stood up, smoothed his jacket, and went to meet the future. Somewhere far away, in a chamber deep inside a hidden world, the Dreth High Council was reading Grethval's report and realizing, slowly and uncomfortably, that their plan was going to need significant revision. And somewhere between the stars, in the cold dark between worlds, the galaxy was shifting, not because a great empire had moved, not because an ancient power had acted, but because a small, young, strange, stubborn species from a blue-green world had shown up, ahead of schedule, already knowing the rules, and had quietly, methodically, without making a fuss about it, started to matter. Not because they were the biggest, not because they were the oldest, but because when things got hard, they got creative. When things got dangerous, they got ready. And when the door finally opened, when the galaxy finally looked at Earth and said, "Well, here you are," humanity looked right back and said, "Yes, here we are, we've been waiting." And they meant it in every possible way.